Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for the second time on the podcast is Peter Mayer. Peter is principal engineer at Water DM and Flume Data Labs. We talk about the issue of water on the Colorado River and in the Colorado River Basin. If I didn't have to focus on anything else going on in the world, I would just focus on water in the United States. It is incredibly interesting. It's incredibly important. And that's why we're going to continue talking about not just the Colorado River, but other water issues in the United States. It's also a great example of how geopolitics is not just an international phenomenon. Peter and I get into the relationships between different American states and even Native American tribes and how all of that is affecting issues on the Colorado River in general. And that all ultimately comes down to politics and political power, which is the little intersection that this podcast tries to shine a light on. So Peter, thanks for taking the time. Listeners, if you missed the first episode with Peter, I'm going to put a link in the description to the podcast. It is worth going back and listening to that first. I didn't want to spend too much time rehashing what we looked at there. Here, we talked mostly about where we're going from here with the recent deal between Arizona, Colorado, and California, but there's enough here. If you just want to listen to this one, that's fine. But if you haven't listened to that first one, I would recommend it. Otherwise, usual housekeeping notes from me. If you are interested in our wealth management services at CI, if you hear me talking about all the investments we do and going long and going short, this, that, or the other thing, and you want to talk about those services and how we can help you potentially, please email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. You can also email me there if you want to talk about the research that we provide to family offices or corporates or other institutions. Happy to provide research. You can talk to me about that. Also, if you are interested in having me speak at your event, anything like that, that is also something you can reach out to my email to as well. Last but not least, if you want to just tell me a book to read or something I was wrong about that I said in the podcast, I particularly appreciate those critiques coming through on the email. So those are all ways to email me directly, and I read everything that comes through. That's about it. We recorded on Friday, June 23rd. This is going to go up probably in about a week and a half, but I'm not expecting a lot of movement on this issue, so it should all be 100% relevant. Okay, enough from me. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Listeners, this is our second episode with Peter about the, shall we call it a crisis, the Colorado River crisis. We'll put a link in the description to the podcast so you can listen to episode 1. But Peter, if the listeners are too lazy to go find the first episode, what is the 2-minute encapsulation of what it is we're going to talk about that's going on in the Colorado River right now?
Well, sure. In quick summary, I mean, the Colorado River is the critical resource for the southwestern United States and provides water to people in Colorado and Utah, in Arizona, in Nevada, and in California. I think New Mexico as well. It's an essential resource. About 60 million people depend upon it. The crisis has occurred because the original assumption is that there was about 20 million acre feet of water that was carried in Colorado each year. Acre foot is a measurement of water. It's about 325,000 gallons per acre foot. And in fact, instead of 20 million, it's been more like 14 million acre feet per year. And some people suggest that it could be as low as 12 million acre feet per year is what's actually likely to be the contents of the river. And so essentially they carved up 20 million acre feet and people started using water. And the storage contents in Lake Mead and Lake Powell have diminished. And last year when we spoke, we're at the point where Lake Powell was in danger of dropping below a power pool where it would no longer be able to actually generate electricity anymore. And there was even talk about dead. So that was really the crisis. And we can talk about what's happened in the meantime.
Yeah, and just to underscore that, I scribbled down a few statistics before we got on just to to underscore exactly what you just said. So roughly 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for drinking water. It irrigates 5.5 million acres of farmland. It's 15% of the farmland in the United States. It irrigates 90% of the winter vegetables that we get here in the United States. So if you like your Caesar salad in the winter, this is something that probably matters to you too. And maybe most shocking to me, about half of that water is used as feed for livestock in general. And something like 80% of the water goes to agricultural uses. So I think the effect on agriculture is probably going to be the biggest thing here. But before we start getting in on impacts and things like that, you're exactly right. When we last spoke, not only were we worried about dead pool and not producing water in some of these reservoirs, but the federal government looked like it actually meant business. It looked like it was going to unilaterally go into these states and say, okay, Colorado and Arizona and California, if you can't agree on accepting cuts that we want on the river, and I believe the government was looking for between 2 and 4 million acre feet annually was what they were sort of driving at.
That's correct.
We are going to come in and start cutting unilaterally. And what happened, I guess it was a couple months ago now, was that magically the states came to an agreement. But maybe I'll just set you up there to say the agreement. I don't know. Like once you start to actually look at the details, it's a little bit underwhelming.
Yes, I mean, the agreement is for about 1 million acre feet per year of cuts for the next 3 years. It would be a total of about 3 million acre feet, whereas what the federal government had asked for was between 2 and 4 million acre feet per year. So over the same period of time, they would be looking for more like 6 to 12 million acre feet in cuts, as opposed to the 3 million that have been offered.
Not a particularly heartwarming point of view. And all of this expires in 2026. So by the time we get to 2026, all this goes away, right?
Yeah, and 2026 is a critical date because that's when there is essentially a new agreement that would come into place. And that new agreement is the operating agreement for the river. Is basically how the river will be divided up based on different flows and reservoir elevations. And that the federal government just announced about a month ago the opening of the negotiation period for this new agreement. And so now, between now and 2026, we're operating under the old agreement and the potential cuts that we just talked about after 2026. Then, assuming they can reach agreement, then there would be a new arrangement put into place. So the next few years will be an intense period of negotiation, fairly fraught, depending on what happens with the hydrology.
Well, and also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here. So we're going to do this negotiation over the next 3 years. The last time you were on the podcast, you talked about some of your experience in water legal battles and things like that. And I mean, if memory serves, it was taking 9-10 years to resolve some of these legal battles. So we're just going to magically figure this out in 3 years? That seems completely unrealistic to me.
Well, what we talked about last time was a Supreme Court case. So if someone were to file a court case, yes, then we could be looking at 5, 10, 15 years type of a thing, depending on the situation. A negotiation is very different, though. And 3 years is a reasonable amount of time for the parties to come to agreement. The problem, as I see it, though, is what will happen with the intervening hydrology. So this winter, what just happened was extremely wet and snow-filled winter, particularly in California, and the Sierras had absolutely record snowpack. So California's water supply system includes water that comes from the State Water Project from the Sierras and the Colorado River. And so when they have so much more water coming from the state water supply system, it does take some pressure off the Colorado River. So that's a very helpful thing. The other thing that's helpful is that the winter in the West, in Colorado and Utah, was also very big. Record in some places like Utah. And so the runoff into Lake Powell it has actually been really good, and the lake level has raised up by 40 or 50 feet. And so that in itself takes some of the pressure off. Of course, it could easily drop back down with just 1 year. It would take the understanding is that it would take 6 years or more of winters just like the one we had in order to refill the lakes.
Yeah, and we're going to have my favorite weather guy, Daryl, if you're listening. This is one of the questions you'll be getting asked in a couple weeks, so maybe brush up on your winters in the American Southwest and what that's going to do for the situation. But what is from your point of view, from a hydrology point of view, how common was last year's winter? I mean, is there any chance that the next 3 years we actually see water levels improve on these lakes significantly, and that causes the negotiations to go maybe to not make cuts that are as drastic as they maybe need to be on a long-term basis? Or was this really just kind of dumb luck that these states managed to find all of this extra water at the last second via a fairly wet winter?
Well, I wouldn't say dumb luck, but it's very difficult to predict what the available water supply is going to be from year to year, given the variability that we've seen. And climate change is contributing greatly to that. And what it looks like is that, we're going to have situations where we have these big years and also situations where we have these extended dry periods. And so we're just switching from La Nina, which is what we just went through, to an El Nino. And so, this big snowpack had occurred sort of in this transition year. So the question I'd be interested for your guest, your weather expert, is what does it mean in the Southwest when we have a strong El Nino? Because that's what it looks like is going to happen. And there's differing stories. It could get drier, could get wetter. It depends on the place. I'd be interested in what his perspective is.
Yeah, I will definitely ask him that. But in the meantime, I think there's also differing perspectives on what the water reduction levels are going to be on the river in general. I was trying to do a little bit of research before we got on the call to remind myself of these things. And the deal is it's currently constituted just for the next 3 years. It looks like a reduction of water usage of about 13%. I found one study that said they're expecting reduction of Colorado River flow of 20% over the next 30 years based on climate change. And I found things kind of all over the place. Where do you fall on that? Do you think we're going to see decrease in flow in the Colorado River, and over what time scale do you think it might happen? Accepting that, we're trying to do the impossible here in predicting water flows in the Colorado River.
Well, I think we have a pretty good idea of what's happening, and they are being reduced, and we need to plan for them to be. And then we need, and then when something like this past winter occurs, we can take that bounty and store it and use it later. But currently we have to cut use now and into the future until we can raise the lake levels up back again, if that's even possible, and then at least stabilize the system to some extent. I think truly the long-term perspective is going to be some form of stabilization based on cuts largely in the lower basin, and then it's going to have to become more of a hydrology-based system where there'll be some guarantees year to year in the lower basin, but much less, and it'll have to be the allocations will likely have to be based more on what Mother Nature is providing.
Farmers in some parts of the United States will enjoy the question I'm about to ask, and those that are those that are dependent on the Colorado River will not like the question I'm about to ask. But Peter, it seems to me that the easy way to fix this issue would be to just say you can't have large-scale agriculture in an arid region, in one of the driest regions in the United States, and base it on the Colorado River. If you take out agriculture from the equation here, probably the Colorado River can provide enough power and enough drinking water for the number of people that are actually living in these areas. That's my way of starting to get at the question of what you think is the best way to organize this, because it's sort of a misnomer to say that the states are just cutting 13% usage. They're not just cutting 13% usage. They are going to pay farmers in particular, or those with industrial uses, other uses, they're going to pay them roughly about $1.2 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. That apparently averages out to about $521 per acre foot of water not used. They're going to compensate all of these different actors for not using the water in general. And for frame of reference, even the most expensive water usage in some of these farms and in some of these other areas, you're talking about $20 acre foot of water. So it's sort of an easy math decision there. I'm instead of spending $20 per acre foot of water to plant crops, I am now going to receive 521 per acre foot of water that I don't use. All of which is to say, I don't understand how that's sustainable. So if you were emperor of the universe and you could fix this, however, if you could ignore the politics, ignore everything else, what do you think is the ideal way to actually fix what's going on in the Colorado River compared to what we're trying to do right now?
Well, what we're trying to do right now is to lease the water, essentially to pay that $500 per acre foot, and that's per year. And then even after we've done that for 3 years, that farmer still holds the water right. And that is absolutely not sustainable. The solution is absolutely to retire agriculture, and not all agriculture by any means. I think we still actually have quite a bit of robust agriculture, but there is going to need to be agriculture uses retired permanently in the Colorado River Basin. I don't see any way around it besides that, and I would much rather see money being spent today to buy the water rights permanently rather than to lease them temporarily. I think we're just spending money that we're going to end up spending more money than to buy these things permanently. It's at some point in the future.
Well, and I feel like this entire episode shows how unplanned or how all over the place the United States government is with this situation. Because when we spoke last, it was earlier this year, I think. But the last time we spoke, I really thought the federal government was going to come in here and have to make some very unpopular decisions. But then you have the very wet winter combined with apparently there's a couple billion there just waiting in the Inflation Reduction Act. That aside, I don't know if you saw this news that I think for the second time the Pentagon came out and said because of a clerical error or some kind of error, they found another $6 billion they can spend on weapons for Ukraine. How come these clerical errors never go with income taxes and put more money in my pocket? I don't know. But the point being, like, it's not going to be every year that the United States is going to have $1.2 billion of money that's already been allocated via the Inflation Reduction Act and a super wet winter. And yet those two contingencies is what has driven this settlement for water cuts that are not even close to what the U.S. government asked for. I guess I don't know if there's a question there. It just feels exasperating. Like how are we actually going to fix this? It doesn't sound like it's going to get fixed ever.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not sure that the federal government is the one that's going to ride into the rescue either. I mean, they could perhaps provide money that's needed, but I think, as you point out, there may not be enough money there to do ultimately what's required. This is a situation between the states in many ways. I mean, this is the Colorado River is an interstate issue, and those are the actors who are going to have to settle it and to negotiate the reductions and figure out perhaps the compensation. I think the federal government is sort of sitting there, pulling whatever strings they can and then offering money, to try and grease the wheels. But ultimately their seat at the table is not as powerful as the interests of the states and the water rights holders on the Colorado River.
I'm a huge fan of Robert Caro and his LBJ biographies, and I think he has a really good way of talking about big government in a non-ideological way, which is he basically talks about how, even the staunchest libertarians in the United States realized in the 1920s and 1930s that some things were too big for the states or some things were too big for local communities. So if we think about rural electrification, the United States government had to intervene there because if you had just left it up to the market, if you had just let things go without the federal government intervening, you would have never had rural electrification. The modern day version of this conversation is about, high-speed internet access in rural communities. The federal government is just announced earlier this week that they're going to be spending a lot of money on trying to build that up because it doesn't make sense for providers to do that. You're not going to make a return because there's not enough people out there doing it, which is a way of saying, This seems like maybe a problem that is too big for the states. Maybe I'm not giving the states enough credit, but I don't know. I mean, do the states have enough? California maybe, but do Arizona and Colorado have the resources necessary to compensate the interests that are going to be hurt by making the cuts on the Colorado River that you actually have to make it sustainable?
That's a good question. I mean, it really depends how things are structured. But you also have to understand what's going on with the federal government is that they are trying to avoid everyone, and they understand that if this goes to the Supreme Court, then everything gets delayed. The whole system could crash. I mean, it becomes a situation that could be potentially untenable, or and in ways that nobody has considered. So their primary interest is to nudge things along and to help the states reach the agreement. Now, the compensation is one of the issues. It's interesting to think of to consider the two proposals that the Feds put out there, sort of bracketing the negotiations. One proposal was to follow prior appropriation, the existing rules of the Colorado River, which would grant California the senior water right in the lower basin, and cuts would be taken largely by Arizona. That proposal is anathema essentially to Arizona and to Nevada. The upper basin is much more agnostic because they're not impacted. The other proposal on the other side was the cut should be proportional, based on on your allocation of the river, not on your seniority. And that's much more what Arizona would like, because that allows them to maintain their water supply. California takes a much larger portion of the cuts under that scenario. So those are kind of the two extremes. And where we're going to end up is going to be somewhere in the middle, probably closer to the Arizona solution than the California one, if I had to guess, just because I doubt, well, I don't know. I mean, how it really comes to how deep of cuts is Arizona going to sustain. That ultimately is I think where the rubber hits the road. It's California versus Arizona. The Nevada component is quite small. So when you're dealing with the volumes of water and where the pain is going to occur, the big fight will be whether it occurs mostly in Arizona or whether it occurs mostly in California.
Well, and you probably saw Phoenix has banned now new construction, it looks like, in the Phoenix area because of future concerns about water reliability.
That's actually only in one particular area. So outside of their groundwater management zones, they have their very particular rules. And the development that you're thinking of was had a water purchasing agreement from Scottsdale, to have water delivered, and it was in Scottsdale said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. Essentially, really, and so they're going to get water from another location. It's going to limit some growth, but not necessarily in Phoenix. Phoenix actually considers that they have ample supply for additional growth.
Well, there are also obviously Native American tribes that are affected by this as well. So I don't want to not mention them. But if it really is, Arizona and California are the two big players, this sort of gets into where geopolitics starts to intervene, not geopolitics between nations, but between states. And I would have just guessed that California is the much wealthier, the much more powerful, the much more politically influential state in a battle between Arizona and California. So you said it would probably be resolved more in Arizona's favor, but I'm going to push you on a little. Why would it be resolved in Arizona's favor? I would think that if they're competing against California, it's not much of a contest.
I would agree with you, but will become an existential fight for Arizona, because they are so reliant on the Colorado River water. So it really will become a question of California ag versus Arizona urban, and that's where the federal government will come in, I predict, and that's where money will flow to ensure that you don't have a depopulation.
Yeah. What because we're talking now about states and about the federal government. You mentioned the sort of threat of Supreme Court action or legal action like that could, take us many, many years down the road to where the river's dried up while we're still arguing about this in a court somewhere halfway across the country. Does it have to come from the states, though? Can one farmer lodge a protest against something being taken away from them that will make it to the Supreme Court? Is that one of the reasons that you have to figure this out from a legal basis, because you can't just confiscate land because it opens you up to all of those different legal rabbit holes?
Yes. I mean, so maybe not one farmer, but let's say the Imperial Irrigation District in California, which holds the largest water right, agricultural water right on the Colorado River. I mean, they could be a party, certainly, to a lawsuit. So yes, many actors and uses and considerations are come into play. It is a high wire balancing act within the states and between the states. And then you mentioned the tribes, and the tribes' role is much more important now than it ever has been, because they have, there are tribes that actually have settled water rights, so they actually hold water rights, and others that certainly have valid claims. And what we're seeing with tribes in Arizona is that they are entering into agreements to lease their water to urban providers. So essentially, they have the senior water from the tribes then is paid for it to go to the cities. So, and that is a role, I mean, that I would expect you could see expansion, where you see tribes essentially paid annually for water that they are not taking. In a similar way that you could see farmers paid also to fallow farms, crops, and to allow water to flow it down. Now, that hasn't occurred much in the upper basin yet. They considered the concepts of demand management and fallowing, and it really hasn't gone anywhere. And there are lots of questions. So the whole role of the upper basin in this is still remains a big question, and that's a place perhaps where the federal government could step in to say to the upper basin, okay, we're not going to support any additional withdrawals from the Colorado River. So what you have now is what you're going to get, essentially, because most of the upper basin states still have their eye on additional water supply. So, and that remains a very open question.
Forgive the dumb question. Which states are upper basin?
So upper basin would be Colorado and Wyoming and Utah. Those are the states where that are headwaters states, essentially. And they also use water from the Colorado, particularly Colorado is the largest user in the basin, but all of those states use it, and then eventually through a whole an elaborate network of rivers, that eventually forms into the single river, the Colorado, and then that flows into Lake Powell, and the flows into Lake Powell are considered the contributions of the upper basin to the lower basin.
Can you imagine scenarios in which, like, Utah and Wyoming will make some deal with California to support California's negotiating tactics for some other concessions down the road, or is that a little too Game of Thronesy?
I many things are possible, but in general, I think what you will see is the upper basin trying to stick together and the lower basin. The upper basin trying to stick together against the lower basin. The lower basin might look to the upper basin, but there could be fights within the lower basin before they look upstream. I'm not sure. That's I have no idea what the legal strategy might be. I don't see a good legal strategy in a lawsuit from any of the interested parties. I think once it goes to the courts, then there could be no money involved. You could lose water, without getting any compensation. So if you're someone that has water rights in the lower basin, and you're thinking, well, I'd like to keep my water, but if I can't keep my water, I'd at least like to get paid for it. I think avoiding a lawsuit is also in your interest.
Yeah, the only heartening thing, which I use that word relatively, you've said so far to me in this conversation, is that it sounds like legal action by any actor is mutually assured destruction. Because if this gets into the courts, it's, like I said, by the time we actually get to some kind of resolution, we might not have much of a Colorado River to be talking about here, or at least, thinking about water withdrawals from that region. So maybe there is some reason for these states and for all these interests to get to the negotiating table, because if they spend their time in court for the next 10 years, things are probably that dire. But I guess that's where I would turn for the last part of our conversation, which is, what does this look like over the next 10 years? And I know it's impossible to think about that, but where do you think we go from here? Do you think that it's relatively non-dramatic, and just in 2026 we'll get to the end of the negotiating progress, and Arizona will probably get the short end of the stick, but it'll accept it because there's no other choice? Like, how do you think things are going to develop from here?
Well, I think it's going to be a very tough negotiation. I think there will be plenty of threats, and I think the federal government will probably have to use its strong arm at moments, perhaps. But I do think that they will eventually come to an agreement. I actually think an agreement is possible. Whether it will be sufficient to match the hydrology is something else. That is a tough question. The lower basin they're used to basically being able to know with some certainty every year how much water supply they're going to have, and that is something that I question to what extent that is going to be able to continue in the future. Maybe they'll be guaranteed some minimum amount annually, and then the amount on top of that would fluctuate from year to year based on the lake levels and the hydrology, something along that order. And then in the upper basin, what's going to happen? That there is, I think, much more of an open question. And there, I think I'm looking to the federal government as well, because there are plenty of water providers that have their eyes on additional Colorado River water based on paper entitlements. Not necessarily based on wet water in the river, but all of the upper basin states theoretically have not used their full entitlement of the Colorado River, and they have never agreed that they weren't going to do that. So that's the question, I think, for the upper basin is how much water are they committed to not using in the future. And are there going to be limits in the upper basin as well as limits in the lower basin?
What is, and I apologize if this is also a dumb question, but
there's just, no. These are not dumb questions at all. This is a very complicated situation.
Well, I haven't asked this one yet. So, but what is stopping, say, Arizona and California and even the federal government from getting together and deciding to just build a bunch of water desalination plants on the coast and building pipelines to pipe desalinated water from the coast to the places that need the water?
Well, it's not a dumb question at all, because that's exactly what Arizona is considering. So originally this idea was that they could build desalination plants in California, and California would then use that desalinated water, and then Arizona would just take Colorado River water that previously belonged to Arizona. That would seem to be the simplest solution. But California said, no way are you building massive, energy-intensive, environmentally destructive desalination plants on our coastline. And so what did Arizona do? They looked south to Mexico and they said, hey, how about we build some desalination plants in Mexico? And so that is the proposal now. I don't think Mexico has any interest in that. It's extremely expensive and energy intensive, and it commits water users in Arizona to the most expensive water for ever, essentially moving into the future. You would rather do almost anything than make that sort of a water supply arrangement, at least as we currently understand desalination.
How expensive would it be?
How expensive would it be? Well, probably on the order of $4,000 to $5,000 dollars per acre foot per year. It's an annual cost for desalination. You have the upfront cost, which of the plant, which get capitalized, but then it's the ongoing cost of running it, maintaining it, and historically, these large desalination plants have underperformed and generally cost much more than anticipated.
And that rough, I won't quote you on the figure, but I know that rough figure, 3,000 to 4,000 per acre foot of water. That's startup cost, or that's like there's already a desal plant, but that's just the maintenance and the energy and everything else that's going.
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I believe that includes some of the capitalization of the plant costs too. But that's generally when we think about it, if you had to get desal water for a utility, what are you thinking? What are you looking at? $3,000 to $5,000 per acre foot is not outside the range of the cost of that water.
Right, and I can see how that's not particularly economical either. I know you're. Well, I don't want to speak for you. I'm guessing that you're not a desal expert, but is there any chance of driving down the cost of desalination enough to make it? Because right now the federal government's talking about spending $521 per acre foot to compensate farmers who are not going to use water. So obviously 3,000 to 4,000 is not going to work. But could we knock it down? Is there any possibility of knocking it down to 1,000 or 500 in the next 5 years if we actually spend some time on it and some energy and resources on it?
Oh, there's been tremendous energy and resource put into desalination. Yes. Think about all the Saudi Arabia and Israel. The work that's put into desal has been immense and it has improved, but it's still very energy intensive. And still creates environmental problems along coastlines in particular areas. So the difference though, like you talked about the $500 an acre foot leasing on the Colorado River. So that's raw water versus potable water, but that's raw water that has been conveyed through an elaborate federally funded system. One of the things that is particularly frustrating to me when I think about all of the users on the Colorado River is that all of these folks have benefited hugely from the investment of all of us in the federal government in creating the dams and creating that water supply, and now suddenly we're going to also have to pay these people not to take the water that we've subsidized for them all these years. It is frustrating, but it's the world that we live in.
Yeah, there should be a PhD student, or maybe we can just ask ChatGPT to do this now to compare the cost of all the dam systems and the infrastructure that's gone into creating this water system versus what it would take to, invest in sort of a desal system as well. I would hope that maybe that figure would get closer than we think. But it's funny you mentioned the energy intensive thing, because I take the point on big desal plants being, bad for the environment. Although, Mexico makes some sense there because, you're just right across the border from Arizona. That's just the Sonoran Desert. There's not a whole lot going on there. So, maybe it's an area where you could do that sort of thing. But theoretically, this is one of the driest parts of the entire United States. You should have ample solar energy. The United States is awash in natural gas. Like for a country like the United States, energy should not be the problem here. We could probably drive down the cost of energy to be just about cheaper than anywhere else in the world, I would think.
Well, if we're going to use natural gas, then we're just digging the hole even deeper with climate change. If you want to do solar, I mean, again, it's like California didn't want this. Why is Mexico going to accept this? So, I mean, there's many reasons that's not the optimum choice. I would contend let's retire some farmland in California and some farmland in Arizona. Let's move that production to the Midwest and to places where there's more water, and that's it. That's all we got to do. That's your cuts, and your cities need to stay as ultra efficient as possible. They're not going to get any more water, and they need to manage their their growth accordingly. But I do think there is a solution before us. It is going to be painful to agriculture in the Southwest. But I do believe that animal fodder can be grown elsewhere. And that is a much, much more reasonable, less expensive solution than, desalination plants in Mexico.
Yeah, or in California. But I mean, the flip side there is, I was in. We're recording here on June 23rd. This is going to come out in about a week and a half. But so about a week ago, I was in North Dakota talking to some Midwestern farmers, and the big thing in the Midwest now is renewable diesel and sustainable air fuel, and EPA things or targets on biofuels and things like that. And you have lots of farmers who are thinking about planting corn and soybeans and things like that to provide biofuels for California. Ironically, of all things, it's California that says they want renewable diesel quotas. So they're going to take all of these soybeans and crush them so that they can have renewable diesel. The point being, though, that if you're right, and I think you are right, especially about the water situation in the Southwest, the question then becomes this really interesting calibration of government policy, which is, well, does the federal government try and tip the scales towards biofuels as it has done with ethanol for a long time? Do we start to have competition between acres for human consumption versus acres for energy production? Is it more cost effective for a Midwestern farmer to plant some of those? Well, I don't know if they could plant some of those winter vegetables that are being grown in Arizona. I mean, that one of the things that jumps out to me is the level of winter vegetables that's coming from this part of the United States, because I don't know that transports as well. But I'll serve it up to you. Where do we go from here as we close out the podcast?
Well, we need to reduce water use. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, there's not enough water in the system. So if we want to stop the system from collapsing, we have to reduce water use. 50% of the water is being used to grow fodder for animals, crops like alfalfa. I would argue that's where we start. And let's buy the farm if we need to. And let's move that production somewhere else where there's more water available. And we can maintain production in critical crops such as, the winter vegetables and other things. I think that's actually still possible. I don't think we have to completely eliminate ag at all. I think you're talking about, a significant cut to what you'll be able to grow for animal feed. But if you were to try to solve the problem entirely with alfalfa, I think there is a way to do it.
Do you have a rough figure in your head for what it would take to buy the farms in question? Like how much that would actually cost?
I have no idea. And that is a really tough one. And someone was with a better understanding of the economics, and also it kind of depends on the situation of the purchase. I mean, is it a forced sale? Is like, well, you're going to get nothing, or you're going to take this deal, or is it actually going to be, a highest bidder type of a situation? I don't know how that might play out, but I'm sure that the folks will be well compensated. I mean, clearly they're already being well compensated just for the leases.
Yeah, I mean, the Dutch government is going through this right now. So the Dutch government is buying farms because they want to reduce emissions from farmers in the country. And you've probably seen the Dutch farmer protests. In part, I don't want to say they're shortchanging them, but there's a couple of different things going on here. People don't want to sell their land. They don't want to sell their farms. These are usually things that have been in families for generations. And the farming temperament too is not just to do that. It's also about, you can sell a farm, but are you compensating them for, future earnings lost? What are these people supposed to do if they know how to do this? It's not so easy to just go up and set up a farm in another place. It really is a difficult question. So this might be one of the reasons it is such a hard thing, because, I look at this and I say desal plants, and you look at me like I have a hunchback, and then you say, well, let's just buy the farms. And I'm like, all right, well, the Dutch government tried that. They've got massive protests, and where's that money going to come from too? So eventually somebody's going to have to take a hit here, I would think. And you're probably right that it's going to be the American taxpayer somehow, but how and where that happens is still to be determined, it sounds like.
Yeah, it'd be nice if you could have water ratepayers actually fund this. There's people whose water supply, is part of this deal. So it certainly makes sense that some of the burden should be on the people who are using the water, and have chosen to live in this place and rely on this water supply.
Yeah, although a lot of these people have been around. So, we can say that about whoever settled there. And when was the initial agreement? Like 1922? Like, if somebody's been on a farm for 2 or 3 generations, they didn't choose to live there. They were born there. They were born into the thing. So I don't know.
Well, but that's the thing. I'm thinking of people in the cities, and the cities are where the money is. Water flows uphill to money. And so it's the urban sector that will pay to buy the water from the agricultural sector.
Right. Water flows uphill to money. That's the third principle of osmosis, right?
Yeah, it's one of those ones that's crazy but true.
Peter, before I let you go, anything I should have asked that I didn't, or anything else you want to give parting thoughts to the listeners about this issue?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that there's a good faith effort going on here. On this, from what I can see, that the states are really negotiating in good faith at this point. And we have a lot of reason for optimism because of that. And I think the role of the federal government is to try to avoid that lawsuit and to keep people at the table. And so far, everyone's dancing together. So let's see what happens. Hopefully, Mother Nature will continue to be generous. Wouldn't that be amazing? Give us a reprieve in time and providing additional water. But that's not something that we can count on. So we do need to put a plan in place that will enable us to stabilize the system and to move forward, where we don't have to have an existential crisis every single year.
Well, I hate that I have this thought, but I guess I'm just a little demented this way. We don't want Mother Nature to be too generous, because if she's too generous, then maybe the complacency will set back in, and we'll get more reductions that aren't really reductions, and we'll just kick the can further down the road.
That's the hydrologic cycle. That's usually what happens. You go from this incredible concern and panic during a drought to apathy during the time of rain, and it's been documented throughout history. People forget about the droughts when there's water. So that's, but I don't think that's the case with the people at the negotiating table. I think they understand the severity of the situation.
Yeah. All right, well, Peter, this story is obviously not going away, and I hope you'll allow us to call on you, not just for this, but for all the other water issues that are probably happening in the United States here over the next couple of years as climate change really asserts itself.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to join you. Thanks so much, Jacob.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.